Grumpy old man moves in. What the wife uncovers stuns the family. A story of resilience and hope that will touch your heart. Welcome back. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and enjoy the story. In the quiet suburb of Oakridge, a shocking announcement disrupted the peaceful household of Martha and Henry Wilson. It was a crisp autumn morning when Henry hung up the phone, his face ashen with disbelief, and something Martha recognized immediately as dread. "Dad's being evicted," he said flatly, refusing to meet her eyes. "His building's been sold. He has nowhere to go." Martha's heart sank as she watched her husband's shoulders tense. Harris Wilson was 78 years old, a stoic and withdrawn widower who had barely featured in their family life. The few times she'd met her father-in-law, he'd been cold and distant, a shadow of a man whose relationship with Henry was fraught with decades of unspoken resentment. "He can stay with us," Martha said without hesitation, her voice gentle but firm. "Just until he finds something else." Henry's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. You can't be serious. You don't know what he's like, Martha. He can't stay here." But Martha had made up her mind. Her years as a school teacher had taught her that behind every difficult person was a story worth understanding. "He's your father, Henry, and he needs help." 3 days later, Harris Wilson arrived at their doorstep with nothing but a small suitcase and a lifetime of silence. He was taller than Martha remembered, but noticeably thinner. His once imposing frame now stooped with age. His eyes, startlingly blue like Henry's, darted around nervously as he stepped into their home. "Thank you for having me," he said stiffly, his voice rough from disuse. "It won't be for long." The tension between father and son was immediate and overwhelming. Henry could barely look at the old man, muttering something about showing him to his room before disappearing into his study for the remainder of the evening. Martha was left alone with her father-in-law, standing awkwardly in the hallway of her own home. "Let me show you where you'll be staying, Harris," she said warmly, picking up his suitcase despite his protests. "I hope you'll be comfortable. Here." As she led him to the guest room at the end of the hall, Martha couldn't help but notice how he flinched at sudden movements, how his eyes seemed to catalogue every exit. He reminded her of the rescue dog she volunteered with at the local shelter, wary, defensive, expecting the worst from those around him. "Dinner's at 6, she told him, placing his suitcase on the bed. "But if you'd prefer to eat in your room, that's fine too." Harris nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I won't be any trouble." That first week, Harris rarely emerged from his room. When he did, it was like watching a ghost navigate the house, silent, careful, determined to remain unseen. He ate his meals alone, declined invitations to watch television in the evening, and spoke only when directly addressed. Henry seemed relieved by his father's reclusiveness, but Martha found herself increasingly troubled by it. One evening, after Harris had retreated to his room following another silent dinner, Henry found Martha preparing a tray with tea and cookies. "Don't bother," he said, his voice tight. "He won't appreciate it. Just leave him be, Martha. It's easier that way." Martha set the kettle down with more force than necessary. "Easier for whom, Henry? That man hasn't had a real conversation in days. He's living like a prisoner in our home." "That's how he wants it," Henry insisted. "Trust me, I know him better than you do." But Martha wasn't convinced. The fleeting expressions she sometimes caught on Harris's face, loneliness, regret, a profound sadness, told a different story. And so, despite Henry's warnings, she continued her gentle campaign to connect with the withdrawn old man. It wasn't until the second week that Martha had her first breakthrough. Passing by the guest room with a basket of laundry, she noticed the door slightly ajar. Through the crack, she could see Harris sitting on the edge of the bed, holding something small in his trembling hands. With a start, she realized he was weeping, silent, shuddering sobs that made his entire body shake. Martha hesitated, torn between respecting his privacy and acknowledging his pain. Before she could decide, Harris looked up and saw her standing there. His face immediately closed off, but not before Martha glimpsed what he'd been holding, a worn photograph of a young woman with familiar blue eyes. Later that afternoon, Martha knocked softly on his door with a cup of tea. Harris opened it after a long moment, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. "Thought you might like something warm," she said, offering the cup. "It's getting chilly outside." Harris accepted the tea with a nod, but instead of closing the door as he usually did, he stepped back slightly. Martha took it as the invitation it was and entered the room. It was meticulously neat, the bed made with military precision, the few possessions he had carefully arranged on the dresser. They sat in silence for a while, Martha on the single chair by the window, Harris perched on the edge of the bed. Just as she was about to speak, to fill the growing silence with pleasantries about the weather or neighborhood, Harris cleared his throat. "Her name was Isabel," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his cup. "My daughter." Martha felt her heart skip a beat. Henry had never mentioned a sister. "I didn't know you had a daughter," she said carefully. Harris's mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "Neither does Henry." The revelation hung in the air between them, a small but significant crack in the wall Harris had built around himself. Martha wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Who was Isabel's mother? Where was she now? Why didn't Henry know about her? But she held herself back, sensing that this small confession had cost Harris dearly. Instead, she simply said, "She has your eyes." Harris looked up then, truly meeting her gaze for the first time since his arrival. In that moment, Martha saw not the difficult old man her husband had warned her about, but someone broken by life in ways she couldn't yet understand. And she made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover the truth behind Harris Wilson's decades of silence, no matter how painful it might be. As Martha left his room that evening, she found herself at a crossroads. Should she tell Henry about Isabel immediately, potentially betraying Harris's trust? Or should she keep this discovery to herself, giving the old man time to reveal his secrets on his own terms? The question weighed heavily on her as she prepared dinner, acutely aware of the two men in her home, avoiding each other like opposing magnetic poles. If you're enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. The revelation about Isabel marked a subtle but significant shift in Martha and Harris's relationship. Over the next few weeks, Martha established a routine of afternoon tea with her father-in-law. She would knock on his door at precisely 3 o'clock, carrying a tray with 2 cups and whatever baked goods she had prepared that day. At first, their conversations were halting and brief, with long silences that stretched uncomfortably between them. But gradually, like ice thawing under persistent spring sunshine, Harris began to open up. He spoke of his childhood in a small, coastal village called Windcrest, a place of rugged beauty, where fishing boats dotted the harbor like multicolored beetles. He described traditions now forgotten: the Lantern Festival, where children would release paper boats carrying candles into the sea; the harvest dance, where the entire village would gather to celebrate a successful season; the ritual of first catch, where newly minted fishermen would gift their initial haul to the elders as a sign of respect. "We had so little," Harris told her one rainy afternoon, his wrinkled hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "But there was a richness to life that's hard to explain. Everyone knew everyone. We shared what we had." Martha listened, enthralled by these glimpses into a world so different from the isolated suburbia of their current lives. She began incorporating elements of these traditions into their household. Baking the sweet seed bread Harris described from his childhood, playing the folk music he remembered from village celebrations, even hanging small paper lanterns in the kitchen when the dark winter days seemed particularly oppressive. Henry noticed these changes with visible confusion. "What's with the weird bread?" he asked one morning, eyeing the dense loaf studded with seeds and dried fruits. "And those paper things hanging everywhere?" "Your father was telling me about traditions from Windcrest," Martha explained, watching her husband's face carefully. "I thought it might be nice to bring some of them into our home." Henry's expression hardened immediately. "Don't let him fool you with romanticized stories about the old country. Whatever he's telling you, it's probably half-truths at best." Martha sighed, frustrated by Henry's persistent negativity. "He's just sharing memories, Henry. Is that so terrible?" "You don't know him like I do," Henry muttered, a phrase he'd repeated so often it had begun to lose meaning. "Just be careful." This warning only strengthened Martha's determination to understand the complicated man living under their roof. She began observing Harris more closely, the way he meticulously repaired a loose cabinet hinge without being asked, how he gently tended to the wilting plants on the windowsill, bringing them back to vibrant life. These were not the actions of the callous abandoner Henry had described throughout their marriage. By the 4th month of Harris's stay, Martha faced mounting obstacles in her quest to uncover the truth. Henry grew increasingly uncomfortable with the attention she showed his father, sometimes interrupting their afternoon conversations with trivial requests or hovering in doorways, his presence a silent reminder of his disapproval. Harris himself remained guarded about certain topics. Whenever Martha gently probed about his late wife, Henry's mother, or the years when Henry was young, the old man would retreat into tight-lipped silence or abruptly change the subject. Most frustrating of all, he refused to elaborate on his cryptic mention of Isabel, acting as though the confession had never happened. Meanwhile, their adult children expressed growing concern about the arrangement. Their daughter, Rachel, during her weekly Sunday visit, pulled Martha aside with worried eyes. "Mum, how long is Grandpa Harris staying?" she asked in a hushed voice. "Dad seems so stressed having him here, and honestly, he's not exactly warm and fuzzy, is he?" Martha squeezed her daughter's hand reassuringly. "He's going through a difficult time, Rachel. And yes, he can be challenging, but there's more to him than meets the eye." "But what about you and Dad? This can't be easy on your relationship." The question struck closer to home than Martha wanted to admit. The truth was, Harris's presence had created a tangible strain between her and Henry. Their evening conversations had grown shorter, their weekend routines disrupted by the constant awareness of the third person in their home. Henry had begun, spending more time at his woodworking shop in the garage, coming to bed long after Martha had fallen asleep. "Your father and I are fine," Martha assured Rachel, with more confidence than she felt. "Some adjustments are harder than others, that's all." That night, unable to sleep, Martha found herself restlessly wandering the darkened house. Passing Harris's room, she noticed a thin line of light beneath his door. She hesitated, then knocked softly. "Come in," came his gruff voice. Martha found Harris sitting at the small desk in the corner, surrounded by scattered papers. He quickly gathered them together as she entered, but not before she glimpsed what looked like letters. Dozens of them, some yellowed with age, others newer but crumpled as if handled repeatedly. "Can't sleep?" Harris asked, his tone unusually gentle. Martha shook her head. "Too much on my mind, I suppose. I didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me," he said, gesturing to the papers. "Just organizing some things." Martha's eyes were drawn to an envelope that had fallen to the floor near her feet. She bent to pick it up, noticing it was addressed to Henry Wilson in Harris's distinctive handwriting. The envelope was sealed but dated nearly 20 years ago. "You wrote to Henry?" she asked, holding out the envelope. Harris's face clouded with an emotion Martha couldn't quite identify. Shame, perhaps, or regret. "I wrote many letters," he said after a long pause. "None of them were ever sent." The implication of his words hit Martha like a physical blow. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the pile of letters. After a moment's hesitation, Harris nodded. With trembling hands, Martha began sorting through the letters. There were dozens addressed to Henry, dating back 30 years. Others were addressed to Rachel and Michael Wilson, her children, Harris's grandchildren whom he barely knew, and a few, the oldest and most worn, were addressed simply to Isabel. "I don't understand," Martha whispered, overwhelmed by the volume of unsent correspondence. "Why didn't you mail these?" Harris's eyes were fixed on the letters, his expression haunted. "At first, because I thought they wouldn't want to hear from me. Later, because too much time had passed." "How do you explain decades of silence?" Martha selected one of the letters addressed to Henry, dated shortly after her and Henry's wedding, an event Harris had not attended. "May I read this?" Harris hesitated, then nodded, his shoulders slumping in resignation. Martha carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thin, the handwriting neat but emotional, with words occasionally crossed out and rewritten. "Dear Henry, I know you don't want to hear from me, and I don't blame you. What kind of father misses his only son's wedding? The kind I've been, I suppose. Absent, unworthy, a disappointment. I won't make excuses. There are reasons for what happened between your mother and me, but no excuses. I saw the announcement in the newspaper. Martha looks kind. I hope she is. I hope she gives you the stability and love I failed to provide. I hope your home is filled with laughter and certainty. Everything our home wasn't after your mother became ill. I've enclosed a small gift. It's not much, but it belonged to my father and his father before him. A pocket watch doesn't seem very useful in these modern times, but perhaps its value lies in its history, in the connection to a past you might someday want to know about. I am proud of the man you've become, Henry, despite me, not because of me. That is my greatest regret. Your father, Harris. Martha looked up from the letter, her vision blurred with tears. Henry never received this, she said. It wasn't a question. Harris shook his head. Or the watch. I still have it. These letters, they tell a different story than the one Henry believes, don't they? Harris's weathered face seemed to age further before her eyes. Henry believes I abandoned him and his mother willingly. That I chose to leave. His voice was barely audible now. It wasn't like that, but by the time I could have returned, he didn't want me anymore, and perhaps that was for the best. Martha set the letter down carefully, her mind racing to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew about her husband's past. Harris, why are you telling me this now? Why show me these letters? The old man was silent for so long that Martha thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but filled with a quiet desperation. Because I'm running out of time, Martha, and because you're the first person in 30 years who's looked at me and seen something other than a failure. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the room. Martha reached across the desk and took Harris's, hand in hers, feeling the bones beneath his paper-thin skin, the tremor that never quite left his fingers. I think, she said carefully, it's time for the truth to come out. All of it. But even as she spoke, Martha wondered if unearthing these long-buried secrets might cause more harm than healing. Henry had built his entire identity around being the son who succeeded despite his father's abandonment. What would happen when that foundational narrative was challenged? And what of Isabel, the daughter Henry never knew existed? Martha left Harris's room that night with her head spinning, carrying the burden of knowledge that could either mend her family or shatter it beyond repair. As she slipped back into bed beside Henry's sleeping form, she made a decision. She would help Harris reconnect with his son, but they would need to proceed with caution and compassion. What she couldn't possibly know was that the revelation of the unsent letters was merely the beginning. The true depth of Harris Wilson's secrets and the impact they would have on all their lives was far greater than she could imagine. The next morning at breakfast, Martha studied Henry's face as he read the newspaper, wondering how to approach the subject of his father's letters. Before she could find the words, the phone rang. Henry answered it, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern as he listened. "It's the hospital," he said after hanging up. "Dad's doctor. Apparently he missed his last 2 appointments for his heart condition. They're quite concerned." Martha set down her coffee cup with a thud. Heart condition. Harris never mentioned any health issues. Henry's laugh was bitter. Of course he didn't. The man would rather collapse than admit weakness. "We need to get him to a doctor right away," Martha insisted, already reaching for her phone to schedule an appointment. Henry shook his head. "Good luck with that. Dad's always been stubborn about medical stuff. It's why Mum—" He stopped abruptly, his face darkening. "Why your mum what, Henry?" Martha pressed gently. "Nothing," Henry muttered. "Ancient history." Martha watched her husband retreat behind his newspaper again. Another door closed, another piece of the puzzle missing. The mention of Henry's mother had clearly touched a raw nerve. What had happened during those years? And how was it connected to Harris's absence from their lives? There was little time to dwell on these questions as Martha shifted into action mode, determined to address Harris's health concerns. To her surprise, the old man agreed to a doctor's appointment with minimal resistance. "I figured you'd find out eventually," he told her as she drove him to the clinic. "You're observant, like she was." "Like who was?" Martha asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Henry's mother, Gillian. She could tell when something was wrong before I knew it myself." Harris's voice softened with the memory. "Drove me crazy sometimes how well she knew me." Martha seized the opening. "What happened between you two, Harris, if you loved her?" "Of course I loved her," he interrupted, his voice suddenly harsh. "Until the day she died. But love isn't always enough, is it?" Before Martha could respond, they arrived at the doctor's office and the moment for confidences passed. She sat in the waiting room while Harris was examined, flipping through magazines without seeing the pages, her mind consumed with fragments of a family history she was only beginning to understand. When the doctor called her in, his expression was grave. "Mr. Wilson has a serious arrhythmia that's been inadequately managed. I'm concerned about the strain on his heart. He needs medication adjustment and regular monitoring." Martha nodded, taking the prescriptions and follow-up instructions, while Harris sat stoically beside her, his face betraying nothing. On the drive home, she broached the subject carefully. "The doctor seems concerned." Harris shrugged. "Doctors are paid to be concerned. This is serious, Harris. Why haven't you been taking care of yourself?" There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of raindrops beginning to patter against the windshield. When Harris finally spoke, his voice had lost its defensive edge. "When Gillian got sick, we couldn't afford both her medications and mine. It was an easy choice to make." He stared out the window at the grey suburban landscape sliding past. "After she was gone, I suppose I got out of the habit of caring." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, broke Martha's heart. "Well, you're going to have to get back into the habit," she said firmly, blinking back tears. "There are people who need you around." Harris turned to her with mild surprise. "Are there?" "Yes," Martha said without hesitation. "There are." That evening, as a spring storm lashed against the windows, Martha prepared a simple dinner while mulling over everything she'd learned. The pieces were slowly coming together: Harris's heart condition, the financial strain it had placed on the family, his wife's illness, but critical parts of the story remained obscured. She was so deep in thought that she didn't notice Henry, standing in the kitchen doorway until he spoke. "How bad is it, Dad's heart?" Martha turned in surprise. "You were eavesdropping?" Henry had the grace to look embarrassed. "I overheard you on the phone with the pharmacy. Is it serious?" The concern in Henry's voice, however reluctant, gave Martha hope. Despite decades of resentment, some part of him still cared about his father's well-being. "It could be if he doesn't take his medication and make some lifestyle changes," she answered honestly. "The doctor wants to see him again next week." Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll drive him." Martha approached her husband, laying a gentle hand on his arm. "Henry, I think it's time you and your father really talked. There are things you don't know." "Don't," Henry cut her off, stepping back. "Whatever he's told you, whatever sad story he's spun to get your sympathy, just don't. You didn't live through it, Martha. You weren't there when he walked out on us, when Mom fell apart, when I had to hold everything together at 17. "But what if it wasn't like that?" Martha persisted. "What if there's another side to the story?" Henry's laugh was hollow. "There always is with him. Trust me, I've heard them all." Before Martha could respond, they heard a crash from down the hall, followed by a muffled cry. They rushed to Harris's room to find him on the floor beside his bed, clutching his chest, his face ashen. "Dad!" Henry exclaimed, dropping to his knees beside his father. "I'm fine," Harris gasped unconvincingly. "Just lost my balance." But it was clear he was not fine. His breathing was labored, his skin clammy to the touch. Martha was already dialing 911, while Henry, years of resentment momentarily forgotten, helped his father onto the bed. "Hold on, Dad," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. "Help is coming." Harris's eyes, clouded with pain, fixed on his son's face with something like wonder. "You called me Dad," he whispered. "It's been a long time since I heard that." The ambulance arrived within minutes, and Harris was quickly loaded inside. Without discussion, Both Martha and Henry followed in their car, the tension between them temporarily suspended by the more immediate crisis. At the hospital, they were directed to the waiting room while Harris was rushed into emergency care. Martha watched her husband pace the sterile corridor, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. For the first time, she fully appreciated the depth of his pain, not just anger at his father's perceived abandonment, but a profound grief for all the years lost, all the words unsaid. "He'll be all right," she said softly, though she had no way of knowing if this was true. Henry stopped pacing and sank into the chair beside her. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said, his voice barely audible. "The last time we were in a hospital together. When Mum died, he wasn't there. I called him, left messages, but he never came." Martha took Henry's hand, feeling it tremble in hers. "Did you ever ask him why?" Henry shook his head. "What would be the point?" "Nothing could excuse that." Before Martha could respond, a nurse approached them. "Are you Harris Wilson's family?" They both stood immediately. "Yes," Martha answered. "I'm his daughter-in-law, and this is his son. How is he?" "He's stabilized," the nurse said with a reassuring smile. "The doctor would like to speak with you, and Mr. Wilson is asking for someone named Martha?" Henry's face registered surprise, then something darker. "Go ahead," he said tightly. "He wants to see you, not me." "That's pretty typical." "Henry, it's fine. I'll talk to the doctor." Martha followed the nurse to a curtained-off area where Harris lay connected to various monitors. He looked smaller somehow, diminished against the white hospital sheets, but his eyes were clear as they met hers. "Thank you for coming," he said weakly. Martha took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. "Of course we came. You gave us quite a scare." Harris's mouth twisted in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Not the first time, I imagine." "The doctor says you're stable. They want to keep you overnight for observation." Harris nodded, then glanced toward the curtain. "Henry?" "Talking to the doctor. He'll be in soon." Martha hesitated, then decided to press forward while she had the chance. "Harris, he thinks you didn't come when his mother was dying. He's carried that pain for years." Harris closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to track down his weathered cheek. "I didn't know she was dying," he whispered. "By the time I found out it was too late, she was already gone." "You need to tell him that," Martha urged. "He deserves to know the truth." "The truth," Harris echoed, his voice hollow. "The truth is I failed them both. Maybe not in the way Henry believes, but I failed them all the same." Before Martha could respond, the curtain parted and Henry entered, his face carefully composed. Seeing his father's tears, he stopped short, his expression wavering between suspicion and concern. "The doctor says you were lucky," he said gruffly. "A few more minutes without treatment and things could have been much worse." Harris nodded weakly. "I seem to have used up all my luck a long time ago." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Martha stood, sensing they needed privacy. "I'll go get some coffee," she said, squeezing Harris's hand before leaving. As she walked down the hospital corridor, Martha felt the weight of everything she'd learned pressing down on her. The family Harris had once had, and lost, seemed to haunt these antiseptic halls. Whatever had happened between Harris and Gillian, between father and son, it was clear that the story was far more complex than the simple narrative of abandonment Henry had carried all these years. And somewhere in this tangled history was Isabel, the daughter Henry didn't know existed. Martha wondered about her. Was she still alive? Did she know about her half-brother? And most pressingly, was now the time to reveal this hidden branch of the family tree, with Harris so physically vulnerable? As Martha waited for the ancient coffee machine to dispense its dubious brew, she was startled by a voice behind her. "Mrs. Wilson." She turned to find a middle-aged nurse watching her with curious eyes. "Yes, that's me." The nurse smiled warmly. "I thought I recognized the name. Is Harris Wilson your relative?" Martha nodded. "My father-in-law." "I knew I was right. I was just a student nurse when he was last here, but I never forgot his work. The man's a genius with his hands. Martha frowned in confusion. His work? The nurse's eyes widened. Oh, you must have seen it. The wooden panel in the children's ward? The one with all the carved animals that seem to move when you walk past. Harris Wilson created that, and the chapel doors too. Those incredible scenes from nature. His pieces are all over this hospital. Martha stared at the nurse in astonishment. I had no idea. Oh yes, he was quite well known in the region. His work is in the City Hall, the main library, several churches. He specialized in architectural elements, doors, panels, staircases. True artistry, not just carpentry. Haven't you seen his portfolio? Martha shook her head slowly, pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. Henry was an accomplished woodworker himself, spending hours in his garage workshop creating beautiful, if utilitarian, furniture. But he had never mentioned that his father shared this talent, had elevated it to an art form apparently. He doesn't talk about his work much, Martha said carefully. The nurse nodded understandingly. Artists can be like that, humble, but you should be proud of him. His pieces brought so much joy, especially to the children. That woodland panel got many kids through tough treatments. They'd count the animals, make up stories about them. She glanced at her watch. I need to get back to my station, but please tell Mr. Wilson that Nurse Fiona remembers him and his wonderful creations. Martha thanked her, her mind racing with this new information. Harris Wilson, not just a grumpy old man with a mysterious past, but an artist whose work had touched countless lives, brought beauty and comfort to those in need. Why had he never mentioned this? And more importantly, why hadn't Henry ever spoken of his father's talent? A talent he himself had clearly inherited? With these questions swirling in her mind, Martha returned to Harris's room, 2 cups of mediocre coffee in hand. She found Henry sitting beside his father's bed, both men silent, the air between them thick with unresolved tension. I brought coffee, she announced, forcing brightness into her voice. And I just had the most interesting conversation with a nurse named Fiona. Harris's eyes widened slightly, a flash of recognition crossing his face. She remembered you, Harris, Martha continued, handing Henry a coffee cup. She told me about your woodwork in the children's ward and the chapel doors. Henry's head snapped up, his gaze moving from Martha to his father. What woodwork? Harris sighed, closing his eyes briefly. It was a long time ago. The nurse said your father was a well-known craftsman, Martha explained to Henry. That his work is displayed throughout the region, in this hospital, the City Hall libraries. Henry's expression was one of utter disbelief. That's not possible. Dad worked at the factory. He was a machinist. I was many things, Harris said quietly. The factory job paid the bills. The woodworking, that was something else entirely. Why didn't I know about this? Henry demanded, his voice rising with bewilderment and something like betrayal. All these years and I never knew you were an artist? That your work was important? Harris met his son's gaze steadily. You never asked, Henry. After everything that happened, you never wanted to know anything about my life. The simple statement landed like a physical blow. Martha could see Henry struggling to process this revelation, this new dimension to the father he thought he knew. I want to see it, Henry said finally. Your work. I want to see what you created. Harris nodded slowly. When they let me out of here, I'll show you. It was a small moment, but Martha recognized it for what it was: the first tentative bridge across the chasm that had separated father and son for decades. A shared talent, a common language they might use to begin understanding each other again. As Harris drifted into an exhausted sleep, Henry pulled Martha into the hallway, his face a mask of confusion. Did you know about this? He demanded. His woodworking, Martha shook her head. I'm as surprised as you are. But Henry, this raises so many questions about what else we might not know about your father's life. Henry ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. Martha knew well. I don't understand. If he was this talented artist, why did he abandon us? Why work in a factory? Why not? He broke off, unable to articulate the sense of loss he clearly felt. Martha chose her words carefully. I think there's a lot about your father's choices that we don't understand yet. But Henry, I'm beginning to suspect that what happened between your parents, the reason he left, it might not be exactly what you've believed all these years. Henry's expression hardened. What has he told you? Not enough, Martha admitted, but enough to make me question the story I've heard from you. I think it's time you two really talked, Henry, before it's too late. Henry turned away, staring down the long hospital corridor as if it represented the years stretching between his present self and the abandoned teenager he'd once been. I don't know if I can, he confessed, his voice low. What if I don't like what I hear? Martha placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. What if the truth sets you both free? Have you ever faced a moment when your understanding of someone close to you was suddenly and dramatically challenged, when you discovered there was more to their story than you ever imagined? Tell us your experience in the comments. The next morning, Harris was released from the hospital with strict instructions about medications, diet, and rest. The drive home was quiet, each passenger lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled into the driveway, Harris broke the silence. I'd like to show you something if you're willing, he said, addressing Henry directly. Henry, who had been avoiding his father's gaze since leaving the hospital, looked up in surprise. Show me what? My work, some of it at least. Martha watched her husband's internal struggle play across his face, curiosity warring with the habit of resentment. Finally, curiosity won. All right, Henry said with a curt nod. Once inside, Harris asked for help retrieving a large portfolio case from the top shelf of his closet. Martha noticed how Henry's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the worn leather case, as if he were handling something explosive rather than a collection of papers. They gathered around the kitchen table, where Harris carefully unzipped the portfolio and began spreading out photographs, sketches, and newspaper clippings. Martha and Henry leaned forward, both equally stunned by what they saw. The photographs revealed intricate wooden panels depicting flowing natural scenes, forests where each leaf seemed to catch the light differently, ocean waves frozen in mid-crash, animals so lifelike they appeared ready to leap from the wood. There were grand church doors with biblical scenes rendered in such detail that the figures seemed to breathe, and delicate spiraling staircases that defied the very nature of the material they were carved from. These are all yours? Henry whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Harris nodded, his weathered fingers tracing the outline of a particularly beautiful piece, a children's hospital reception desk, carved to resemble an open storybook, with fairy tale characters emerging from its pages. This one won an award, he said softly. Regional Craftsman of the Year, 1982. Martha saw Henry flinch at the date. He would have been around 15 then. I have something of yours, Harris continued, reaching deeper into the portfolio. He pulled out a small yellowed newspaper, clipping. Your first competition. Henry took the clipping with visible shock. It showed a teenage version of himself, standing proudly beside a simple but elegant bookshelf, a ribbon pinned to his chest. You kept this? Henry asked, his voice barely audible. I kept everything, Harris replied. Every newspaper mention, every school program that listed your name. I might not have been there, but I was following. From a distance. The admission hung in the air between them. Martha could see the conflict in Henry's eyes, anger at the revelation that his father had been monitoring his life while remaining absent from it, confusion about why, and underneath it all, a small boy's desperate need to understand why his father had left. Why? Henry finally asked, the single word containing decades of pain. Harris closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. It's a long story, Henry, and not one I'm proud of. I think we need to hear it, Martha said gently, laying a hand on Harris's arm. All of it. Harris nodded slowly. I suppose it's time. He carefully returned the photographs to the portfolio, then leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. Your mother wasn't well, Henry. Not for a long time before I left. Henry stiffened. She got sick after you abandoned us. The stress... No, Harris interrupted quietly but firmly. She was ill before, for years, but we didn't have a name for it back then, not in our community. Today they'd call it bipolar disorder, with episodes of psychosis. Martha felt her breath catch. This was not what she had expected. "That's not true," Henry said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mom was just emotional sometimes. She had bad days, but—" "Bad days when she wouldn't get out of bed for weeks," Harris continued. "And other times when she wouldn't sleep, would spend all our savings on nonsensical things, would be convinced that people were conspiring against her. Do you remember the summer she painted the entire house purple, inside and out? Or the winter she burned all our furniture because she thought it was infested with listening devices?" Color drained from Henry's face. "Those were isolated incidents. She was under stress. They were symptoms, son, of an illness nobody knew how to treat properly back then. I took her to doctors when I could afford it, but mental health care was primitive, especially in small towns, and Jillian refused to believe anything was wrong with her." Henry pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. "Why are you telling me this now? Trying to justify what you did by blaming Mom's illness?" Harris shook his head sadly. "I'm not justifying anything. I'm trying to explain what happened. I made terrible mistakes, Henry, but leaving wasn't one of them." "What does that mean?" Henry demanded. "I didn't leave, son. She made me go. During one of her episodes, she became convinced I was trying to poison her and you. She called the police, had a restraining order issued. I wasn't legally allowed to come near either of you." The revelation landed like a thunderbolt in the room. Martha watched her husband's face as he struggled to reconcile this new version of events with the narrative he'd carried his entire adult life. That can't be." Henry sank back into his chair, his certainty visibly crumbling. "The courts didn't understand mental illness any better than the rest of us," Harris continued. "All they saw was a terrified woman accusing her husband of attempted murder. I had no resources to fight it, so I left town as ordered, got work where I could, and sent back as much money as possible." "We never got any money from you," Henry said, but doubt had crept into his voice. "I know that now," Harris said softly. "Jillian was in charge of the mail. When I finally managed to get the restraining order lifted, almost 2 years later, and came back to see you, she told me you wanted nothing to do with me, that you hated me for abandoning you. She showed me letters, Henry. Letters she said you'd written telling me to stay away forever." "I never wrote any letters," Henry whispered. "I know that now too," Harris sighed. "But at the time, why would I question it? You were a teenager by then, old enough to make your own decisions. And if you truly believed I'd abandoned you willingly, of course you'd hate me." Martha's mind raced, piecing together the tragic miscommunication. "So you kept your distance, out of respect for what you thought was Henry's wish?" Harris nodded. "I moved to another town, started over, found work as a carpenter, and discovered I had a talent for it. But I never stopped sending money, never stopped following Henry's life from afar. When I heard he was engaged, I tried to reach out again, sent the letter with the family watch." "What letter? What watch?" Henry interrupted. "You never received." "It," Martha said quietly, meeting Harris's eyes. "Just like you never received the dozens of other letters he wrote to you and the children over the years." Harris confirmed with a nod. "When Jillian died, I tried once more, called the hospital repeatedly, but they wouldn't give me information since we were divorced. By the time I found out she was gone, the funeral was over." Henry sat in stunned silence, his worldview visibly collapsing around him. "All this time," he finally said, his voice hollow, "I thought you didn't care, that you chose to leave, that you didn't want us." "It was the opposite," Harris said, his voice breaking. "I wanted nothing more than to be your father, to watch you grow up, to teach you everything I knew." He gestured to the woodworking photographs, including this. "Your talent isn't coincidence, Henry. It's in our blood." As if on cue, the back door opened and Rachel entered, calling out a greeting. "Hello? Anyone home? I brought soup for Grandpa from that deli he liked last week." She stopped short in the doorway, taking in the scene before her, her father's shocked expression, her grandfather's tears, the photographs spread across the table. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously. Martha stood to embrace her daughter. "We're uncovering some old family history, sweetheart. Your grandfather has been sharing his woodworking with us." Rachel moved closer to examine the photographs. "These are incredible," she breathed, picking up an image of an elaborate garden bench surrounded by wooden flowers so realistic they seemed to sway in an invisible breeze. "You made these, Grandpa?" Harris nodded, wiping his eyes quickly. "A lifetime ago." "You never told me you were an artist," Rachel said, a note of accusation in her voice as she turned to her father. "Is that where you get it from?" Henry looked up at his daughter, then back at his father, seeing the connection for the first time. "Apparently so." Rachel continued examining the photographs with growing excitement. "This is amazing. I've been trying to learn carving at my community college class, but I'm terrible at it. Maybe you could teach me, Grandpa." The simple request, delivered without knowledge of the emotional earthquake that had just shaken the foundations of their family, broke through the tension like a ray of sunlight through storm clouds. I would like that very much," Harris said, his voice rough with emotion. Martha watched as something shifted in Henry's expression, a softening, a reluctant opening to possibility. He looked at his daughter's enthusiasm, his father's tentative hope, and seemed to make a decision. "The garage workshop has plenty of room for two," he said gruffly. "Once you're feeling stronger, Dad." The word Dad, offered consciously this time, not in the panic of a medical emergency, hung in the air between them. Harris nodded, unable to speak. Rachel, sensing the emotional undercurrents but not fully understanding them, broke the moment by asking about Harris's health. As Martha explained the doctor's orders, she noticed Henry gathering the photographs, handling them with new reverence, studying each one as if seeing his father for the first time. That evening, after Rachel had gone home and Harris had retired, to rest, Martha found Henry in his workshop, running his hands over a piece of oak he'd been saving for a special project. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, leaning against the doorframe. Henry didn't look up. "I don't know what to believe anymore. My entire life, I thought he abandoned us, that he didn't care. That's what Mom always said." Martha crossed the space between them, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your mother was ill, Henry. She probably believed what she was telling you. But to fabricate letters, to hide his money, his attempts to contact us." Henry shook his head in disbelief. "How could she do that?" "Mental illness distorts reality," Martha said. "In her mind, she might have been protecting you from someone she truly believed was dangerous." Henry looked up, his eyes haunted. "What if she lied about other things too? What if my entire childhood was built on falsehoods?" Martha chose her next words carefully. "There's something else you should know, Henry. Something your father told me." "What now?" he asked wearily. "Your father was married before he met your mother. He has a daughter, your half-sister. Her name is Isabel." Henry stared at her in shock. "A sister? I have a sister I never knew about?" Martha nodded. "Harris doesn't know where she is now. They lost contact many years ago, but he's kept a photograph of her all this time." Henry set down the piece of oak with trembling hands. "This is too much. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my past, it's all unraveling." "Or perhaps it's finally coming together," Martha suggested gently. "The true story, not the one you were told." Henry was silent for a long moment, struggling with emotions too complex for words. Finally, he asked, "What do I do now, Martha? How do I move forward from this?" "Maybe start by getting to know your father," she suggested. "The real man, not the villain you were taught to hate, and perhaps together you could try to find Isabel." The mention of his unknown sister seemed to give Henry something concrete to focus on amid the emotional chaos. "Yes," he said slowly. "I'd like to meet her if she's still alive, if she's willing." Martha wrapped her arms around her husband, feeling the tension in his shoulders, the rapid beat of his heart. "One step at a time," she murmured. "We'll figure this out together." That night, as they lay in bed, Martha reflected on how quickly life could change, how revelations buried for decades could surface and transform everything in an instant. The grumpy old man who had arrived on their doorstep 3 months ago with nothing but a small suitcase and a lifetime of silence was slowly becoming a father, a grandfather, an artist, a man with a complex history of love and loss. And her husband, who had built his identity around being abandoned, was now faced with reconstructing his past and, consequently, his present. The road ahead would not be easy. Trust broken for so long would not mend overnight. Questions remained. Unanswered, wounds still raw. But for the first time since Harris had arrived, Martha felt genuine hope for healing. What she couldn't know was that the revelation about Isabel had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the greatest surprise yet, one that would test their newfound family bonds to their limits. The following weeks brought gradual but significant changes to the Wilson household. With Harris's health improving under Martha's watchful care, Henry tentatively began spending time with his father in the workshop. Their interactions were awkward at first. Decades of misunderstanding couldn't be erased overnight, but their shared passion for woodworking provided neutral ground where they could begin to reconnect. Martha often found excuses to pass by the garage, her heart warming at the sight of the two men working side by side, their movements similarly precise, their concentration equally intense. They rarely spoke beyond the necessary instructions or requests for tools, but the silence between them had transformed from hostile to companionable. Rachel became a regular visitor, eager to learn from her grandfather. Harris proved to be a patient teacher, his gnarled hands guiding hers as she struggled with the basic techniques of carving. To everyone's surprise, Rachel displayed a natural aptitude that matched her father's and grandfather's. "It's in the blood," Harris would say with quiet pride, watching his granddaughter transform a block of wood into something beautiful. Martha's son Michael, initially skeptical about the changes in the family dynamic, gradually warmed to his grandfather during his monthly visits from college. Harris's stories about the coastal village of his youth particularly captivated Michael, who was studying marine biology. "The way you describe the tide pools," Michael told Harris one evening, "it's exactly what my professors talk about, these micro-ecosystems that contain entire worlds." Harris smiled, a rare sight that transformed his weathered face. "I spent hours watching those pools as a boy. My father thought I was wasting time, but I was learning more there than I ever did in school." As May turned to June, Martha noticed Harris becoming increasingly restless, checking the mail with unusual eagerness, spending hours on the ancient laptop Michael had helped him set up. When she asked about it, Harris was evasive. "Just trying to find some old friends," he said, quickly closing the browser whenever she came near. Martha suspected he was searching for Isabel, but chose not to press the issue. Harris would share his progress when he was ready. The breakthrough came unexpectedly one warm afternoon. Martha was tending to her garden when she heard Harris call her name, his voice more animated than she'd ever heard it. "Martha, Martha, come quickly." She rushed inside to find Harris staring at the laptop screen, his eyes wide with disbelief and joy. "I found her," he whispered. "After all these years, I found Isabel." Martha leaned over his shoulder to see the screen, a social media profile for an Isabel Crawford, a woman in her early 60s with familiar blue eyes and Harris's distinctive jawline. "She's in Maplewood," Harris said incredulously. "Less than 2 hours from here. All this time she's been so close." Martha squeezed his shoulder, sharing his emotion. "Have you contacted her?" Harris nodded, pointing to a message he'd drafted, but not yet sent. "I don't know if she'll want to hear from me. It's been over 30 years. "You won't know unless you try," Martha encouraged. "What does the message say?" Harris had kept it simple, introducing himself, explaining that he was her father, expressing his hope to reconnect if she was willing. No excuses, no elaborate explanations, just a humble request for a chance. "It's perfect," Martha assured him, honest and straightforward. With trembling fingers, Harris clicked send, then closed the laptop as if afraid to watch what might happen next. "Now we wait," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion Martha could see in his eyes. They didn't have to wait long. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Harris's laptop chimed with an incoming message. The table fell silent as Harris opened it, his face paling as he read. "She wants to meet," he said, his voice barely audible. "Tomorrow, she's coming here." Henry, who had been gradually coming to terms with the idea of a half-sister, sat down, his fork with a clatter. Tomorrow? That's very sudden. She says she's waited 30 years, Harris read from the screen. She doesn't want to wait another day. A tense excitement filled the house as they prepared for Isabel's visit. Harris was too agitated to sleep, spending the night polishing a small wooden box that Martha hadn't seen before. Henry retreated to his workshop, presumably to process this latest development in his rapidly changing family narrative. Martha busied herself cleaning the house and preparing food, her mind racing with questions about the woman who would soon enter their lives. The doorbell rang precisely at noon the next day. Harris, who had been pacing the living room since dawn, froze at the sound. Henry emerged from his study, his face a mask of nervous anticipation. It was Martha who moved to answer the door, giving both men an encouraging nod. A tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked dark hair stood on the porch, her posture straight, but her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse, a gesture so reminiscent of Harris that Martha felt a jolt of recognition. "You must be Isabel," she said warmly. "I'm Martha, Henry's wife. Please come in." Isabel stepped into the house, her gaze immediately finding Harris, who stood rooted in the center of the living room. For a long moment, father and daughter simply stared at each other, decades of separation hanging in the air between them. "You look like your mother," Harris finally said, his voice breaking. Isabel's composed expression crumpled slightly. "That's what she always said, that I had your eyes, but everything else was hers." "You knew about me?" Harris asked, taking a hesitant step forward. Isabel nodded. "Mom told me everything before she died, that you'd had to leave us when I was a baby, that you'd tried to stay in touch but couldn't. She kept all your letters." Harris closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this information. "She never told me that." "She was protecting me, I think," Isabel said, "from disappointment, in case you never came back." Her gaze shifted to Henry, who stood awkwardly to the side. "And you must be my brother." Henry cleared his throat. "Half-brother. But yes, I only learned about you recently." A small, sad smile touched Isabel's lips. "Same here. Mom only told me about your existence on her deathbed 5 years ago. She said your mother had made it impossible for our father to maintain any connection between us." The confirmation of Gillian's role in separating not just husband from wife, but siblings from each other, hung heavy in the room. Martha watched. Henry struggled with this final piece of evidence that his childhood understanding had been built on falsehoods. "Please sit down," Martha invited, breaking the tense silence. "I've made lunch. We have a lot to talk about." As they gathered around the dining table, Martha observed the 3 blood relatives carefully. Harris, nervous but joyful. Isabel, composed but emotional. Henry, still processing but making a visible effort to be welcoming. They were strangers, connected by DNA, by shared features, by a history that had been deliberately fractured, but was now, against all odds, being pieced back together. Over lunch, Isabel shared her story. She had grown up in various towns as her mother moved for work, eventually settling in Maplewood, where she'd become a high school English teacher. She had married young, had 2 children, twins now in their 30s, and divorced a decade ago. She had her father's talent for working with her hands, though in her case it had manifested as sculpture rather than woodworking. "I have something for you," Harris said when she finished, retrieving the polished wooden box he'd spent the night preparing. "I've carried this for 40 years, waiting for the chance to give it to you." Isabel accepted the box with visible emotion. Inside, nestled on velvet, was a delicate wooden pendant carved in the shape of a rose, hanging from a silver chain. "I made this when your mother told me she was pregnant," Harris explained, "for my daughter to give on her 18th birthday. I never got the chance." "It's beautiful," Isabel whispered, lifting the pendant with reverent fingers. "All these years you kept it?" "I kept everything," Harris said. "Hope is a stubborn thing." Martha noticed Henry watching this exchange with complex emotions playing across his face. Without drawing attention to the gesture, she reached under the table and squeezed his hand in silent support. After lunch, as Harris and Isabel continued catching up, Henry drew Martha into the kitchen, his expression troubled. "I don't know how to feel about all this," he confessed in a low voice. "She seems nice, and I'm happy for Dad, but it's..." A lot to process. Martha nodded understandingly. It is, and you're allowed to have complicated feelings about it. This doesn't erase what you went through as a child, Henry. But it changes how I should feel about it, doesn't it? He asked, genuine confusion in his voice. If Dad didn't abandon us willingly, if Mum was ill and not just difficult. It changes the context, Martha agreed carefully, but not the impact it had on you. Those feelings are still valid. Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. I spent decades being angry at him, Martha. Built my entire identity around being the man who succeeded despite being abandoned by his father. What am I supposed to do with that anger now? Before Martha could respond, they heard a gasp from the living room. They hurried back to find Isabel holding a photograph that Harris had given her face pale with shock. This woman, she said, pointing to someone in the background of the image. Who is she? Harris leaned closer, squinting. That's my sister Judith, your aunt. She passed away many years ago. Isabel shook her head, her hand trembling. That's impossible. This woman, she's my neighbor, has been for 20 years. Her name is Judith Wilson. The revelation landed like a thunderbolt in the room. Harris snatched the photograph, staring at it in disbelief. Judy is alive? And living next door to you? His voice was barely a whisper. That's not possible. I was told she died in the 80s. There was a letter from her husband. She's very much alive, Isabel insisted. Retired schoolteacher, widowed, keeps to herself mostly. But she's been a good neighbor, watches my house when I travel. My sister, Harris muttered, sinking into a chair. All this time, Martha's mind raced to keep up with this latest twist. Your sister might know about Isabel, might have been watching over her without revealing herself. It would explain some things, Isabel said slowly. The birthday cards that always arrived with no return address, the anonymous scholarship that paid for my college, the way she sometimes looks at me as if... She trailed off, overwhelmed. I never connected it. Why wouldn't she tell me who she was? Harris shook his head, equally baffled. Judy and I were close as children, but we lost touch after I married Jillian. She didn't approve of the match. Said Jillian was unstable. He closed his eyes briefly. I should have listened. Henry, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. We need to talk to her. Aunt Judith, if she's been watching over Isabel all these years, she might know more about what happened, about Mom, about why everything fell apart. The determination in his voice surprised Martha. For the first time since Harris had arrived in their home, Henry seemed eager to uncover the truth, all of it, no matter how painful. Isabel nodded, already reaching for her phone. I'll call her now. Ask her to come over. No, Harris said, placing his hand over hers. If she's been keeping her identity secret all these years, there must be a reason. We should go to her, give her the choice of whether to see us or not. The suggestion seemed to calm Isabel. You're right, but she knows me, trusts me. Let me go first, prepare her. As plans were made for a visit to Maplewood the next day, Martha observed the transformation occurring before her eyes. These three people, strangers just hours ago, were now working together, connected by a shared desire to uncover the final pieces of their fractured family history. The search for truth had become a collective mission rather than an individual struggle. That evening, after Isabel had left with promises to call Judith and return the next morning, Martha found Harris sitting alone on the back porch, staring at the darkening sky. Are you all right? She asked, settling into the chair beside him. I don't know, he admitted. Today was more than I ever dared hope for. Seeing Isabel, learning Judy is alive. It's like watching a long-dead garden suddenly bloom again. Martha smiled at the poetic image, so at odds with the gruff man who had arrived on their doorstep months ago. It's never too late for new growth. Harris turned to her, his weathered face serious. Thank you, Martha, for believing there was more to the story, for not giving up on me. That's what family does, she replied simply. Harris nodded, his gaze returning to the emerging stars. Family, he repeated softly. I'd almost forgotten what that word meant. The next morning arrived with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Henry had barely slept, pacing the house until dawn, alternating between excitement at the prospect of meeting his aunt and trepidation about what new revelations might emerge. Martha watched her husband with concern, wondering if the rapid unraveling of his past might be too much too soon. When Isabel arrived to drive them to Maplewood, she brought unexpected news. "Judith knows we're coming," she said, her expression troubled. "When I called to ask if I could bring visitors, she just said, 'It's time,' as if she's been waiting for this moment." Harris nodded, unsurprised. "That sounds like Judy, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else." The drive to Maplewood passed. In tense silence, each passenger lost in their own thoughts. Martha sat in the back with Henry, holding his hand, feeling the nervous energy radiating from him. Isabel's neighborhood was a quiet subdivision of modest but well-maintained homes. She pulled into her own driveway, then pointed to the house next door, a small blue cottage with immaculate gardens. "That's Judith's place," she said. "She's expecting us at 11. As they approached the cottage, the front door opened before they could knock. A tall, slender woman with silver hair and striking blue Wilson eyes stood in the doorway. She was older than in the photograph Isabel had seen, but unmistakably the same person. Her gaze moved past Isabel to fix on Harris, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. "Hello, little brother," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "It's been a long time." Harris stepped forward, his own eyes wet. "They told me you were dead, Judy. And they told me you didn't want to be found," she replied. "We've both been lied to, it seems." She opened her arms, and Harris moved into them without hesitation. The siblings embraced for the first time. In over 40 years, decades of separation dissolving in a moment of reconnection. When they finally separated, Judith turned her attention to Henry. "And you must be Jillian's boy," she said, studying him intently. "You have her chin, but those eyes, those are pure Wilson." "You knew about me?" Henry asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Judith nodded. "I kept tabs on both of you, you and Isabel, from a distance. It wasn't safe to get too close." The cryptic statement hung in the air as Judith invited them inside. Her home was modestly furnished, but filled with books and photographs. Martha noticed immediately that many of the photos were of Isabel at various ages, graduating high school, holding her newborn twins, at what appeared to be her wedding. "You've been watching over her," Martha said, gesturing to the photos. Judith nodded, her expression softening as she glanced at Isabel. "As best I could without revealing myself. It was complicated." "Why?" Isabel asked, the question direct but gentle. "Why couldn't you tell me who you were? That my father was alive, that I had a brother." Judith sighed deeply, gesturing for everyone to sit. "That's a long story, one I've carried alone for too many years. But first," she turned to Harris, "I need to know what you understand about what happened, about Jillian, about why you left." As Harris recounted the story he'd shared with Henry and Martha, the restraining order, Jillian's illness, the decades of separation, Judith listened intently, occasionally nodding in confirmation. "So you knew," Harris concluded, watching his sister carefully. "About Jillian's condition." "I suspected," Judith corrected. "But by the time I was certain, it was too late. You were gone, and Jillian had convinced everyone, including Henry, that you'd abandoned them willingly." "But why didn't you tell me the truth?" Henry asked, leaning forward. "You're my aunt. Why didn't you come to me?" Judith's expression darkened. "Because of Joseph Krantz." The name meant nothing to Martha, but she saw recognition flash across Harris's face. "Jillian's brother," he said grimly. "I'd forgotten about him." "I wish I could have," Judith replied. "After you left, Joseph moved in with Jillian and Henry, ostensibly to help his sister, but in reality to control the narrative. He was dangerous, Harris. Not just physically, though he was that too, but calculating. He intercepted your letters, your money. He reinforced Jillian's delusions when it suited him, and he made it very clear what would happen to anyone who tried to contradict the story he'd created. Martha felt a chill at the implication. "He threatened you?" Judith nodded. "Not just me. He found out I'd been sending birthday cards to Isabel, and threatened her mother too. Said he'd make sure Harris lost access to both his children permanently if I didn't stay in my lane. After your mother passed, Isabel, she continued, turning to her niece, I was able to provide more support, anonymously, through scholarships and such, but Joseph still had his hooks in Gillian and Henry. It wasn't until he died 5 years ago that I felt it might finally be safe to consider revealing the truth. The revelation of this hidden puppet master, manipulating their family tragedy from the shadows, stunned everyone into silence. Martha watched Henry struggle to process this new information, his worldview shifting yet again, as he realized the extent of the deception that had shaped his life. "Uncle Joseph," he murmured. "He lived with us until I was in college. He was always there, always monitoring. I thought he was protecting us, but—" Henry broke off, memories visibly reassembling themselves in his mind. The phone calls he'd intercept, the mail he'd check before I could see it, the way he'd speak about Dad, reinforcing every negative thought I had. "He had his reasons," Judith said grimly. "Your mother's illness made her vulnerable to his influence, and he had a vested interest in keeping Harris away." "What interest?" Harris asked, his expression darkening. Judith hesitated, then reached for a folder on her bookshelf. "After Joseph died, I did some investigating, found these in his personal effects." She handed the folder to Harris. "Bank statements, records of withdrawals from accounts in your name, regular deposits into his own account spanning decades." Harris flipped through the documents, his face growing pale. "My grandfather's inheritance," he whispered. "The money was supposed to go to Gillian and Henry if anything happened to me. I set it up before everything fell apart." "Joseph found the documentation," Judith explained, "realized he could access the funds if you were out of the picture permanently. The restraining order was just the beginning. He needed you to stay away to believe your family wanted nothing to do with you." The pieces were finally falling into place, the elaborate web of lies and manipulations that had kept a family fractured for decades, all orchestrated by a man motivated by greed rather than concern. So, everything, all those years we were apart, it was because of money? Henry asked, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Money was the motive," Judith corrected gently. "But the method was exploitation of your mother's illness, your father's guilt, and your own natural trust in the adults raising you. None of you are to blame for believing what you were so carefully taught to believe." As the full impact of Judith's revelations settled over the room, Martha observed a strange transformation occurring. The anger that had sustained Henry for so long, the guilt that had haunted Harris, the confusion that had shadowed Isabel, all seemed to be shifting, redirecting toward the true architect of their suffering. Joseph Krantz, long dead, was becoming the repository for decades of misdirected emotion. "I have something else," Judith said after a moment, moving to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. "I've been saving these, hoping someday they'd find their way to their rightful owners." She unlocked the chest and began removing items, photographs of Harris and Gillian in happier times, Henry's childhood drawings, school reports, a small collection of wooden toys clearly carved by Harris's skilled hands. "I retrieved what I could whenever Joseph wasn't watching," Judith explained. "Pieces of your shared history he couldn't erase completely." As these fragments of their past were laid out before them, Martha felt the atmosphere in the room shift, from shock and anger to something more bittersweet. Grief for what had been lost, yes, but also appreciation for what had been preserved, and perhaps the tentative beginnings of healing. Harris picked up one of the wooden toys, a small car with moving wheels. "I made this for Henry's 5th birthday," he said softly. "I was never sure if he received it." Henry stared at the toy, memories flooding back. "I remember this," he whispered. "I played with it constantly. Mom told me it came from a neighbor who moved away." He reached out hesitantly, taking the small car from his father's hands. "I had no idea it was from you." "There's more," Judith said, reaching deeper into the chest. She pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age. "This arrived shortly after Isabel's birth. Joseph intercepted it, but I managed to save it before he could destroy it." She handed the envelope to Isabel, who opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple card with a hand-drawn stork carrying a bundle. The message inside read, "To my daughter Isabel, whom I may never meet but will always love. May your life be filled with more joy than mine. Your father, Harris." Isabel pressed the card to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "All this time," she whispered. "All this time I thought you didn't care." "I cared," Harris said, his voice breaking. "I cared so much it nearly destroyed me to be kept from you both." As the afternoon progressed, more artifacts emerged from Judith's careful preservation. Letters never delivered, gifts never received, moments of connection thwarted by a man determined to keep them apart. Each revelation brought fresh pain, but also understanding, filling in the blank spaces of their shared history with truth rather than assumption. By evening, as they prepared to leave, something had fundamentally shifted. The anger and resentment that had defined their relationships for decades had begun to dissolve, replaced by a tentative hope and a shared determination to reclaim what had been stolen from them: time, connection, family. "Will you come visit us?" Henry asked Judith as they said their goodbyes. "There's so much more to talk about, so many years to catch up on." Judith smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'd like that very much. Now that the truth is out, there's nothing holding me back." On the drive home, Martha observed the three Wilsons, father, son, and daughter, sitting together in shared silence. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers anymore, but the comfortable quiet of family, processing a shared experience. Harris sat in the front beside Isabel, occasionally reaching over to pat her hand, while Henry sat behind them, the wooden car clutched in his fingers like a talisman. Back at the house, as Isabel prepared to leave with plans to return the following weekend, she surprised everyone by embracing Henry. "Little brother," she said with a gentle smile, "we have a lot of catching up to do." Henry, who had been reserved with her throughout the day, returned the embrace with unexpected emotion. "Yes, we do," he agreed, "and I'm looking forward to..." As the days turned into weeks, a new routine established itself in the Wilson household. Harris, no longer the withdrawn, bitter man who had arrived months ago, began to flourish. His health improved steadily, his conversations grew more animated, and most remarkably, he returned to his craft with renewed passion. The garage workshop, once Henry's exclusive domain, became a shared creative space where 3 generations of Wilsons explored their inherited talent. Harris taught Rachel the traditional techniques he had mastered decades ago, while Henry incorporated these classic methods into his more contemporary designs. Even Michael, home for summer break, discovered an unexpected aptitude for wood turning. Isabel visited regularly, sometimes bringing her grown twins, sometimes just coming alone to spend quiet time with the father she was finally getting to know. Judith joined them for Sunday dinners, filling in the missing pieces of family history, with stories that made them laugh and sometimes cry. Martha watched these transformations with quiet joy, particularly the change in Henry. The anger that had defined him for so long gradually melted away, replaced by a thoughtful introspection as he reassessed his past through the lens of truth rather than deception. "I don't know who I am without that anger," he confessed to Martha one night as they lay in bed. "It drove me for so long to prove I didn't need him, to be better than him, to succeed where he had failed. But he didn't fail, did he? He was prevented from succeeding as a father." "Perhaps now you can just be Henry," Martha suggested, "not defined by what you thought your father did or didn't do, but by who you choose to be moving forward." The major turning point came in early autumn, when Harris received an unexpected phone call. The local Arts Council was planning a retrospective of regional craftsmen and had discovered his early work in their archives. Would he be interested in displaying some pieces in the upcoming exhibition? Harris, overwhelmed by the invitation, initially refused. "That part of my life is over," he told Martha. "I haven't created anything worth showing in years." "That's not true," Martha countered. "The pieces you've been making with Rachel are beautiful, and Henry told me about the rocking chair you're designing together. This could be a chance to reclaim another part of yourself that Joseph took from you, your public identity as an artist." After much persuasion from the entire family, Harris eventually agreed, on one condition, that the exhibition would feature not just his work, but pieces created by Henry, Rachel, and Isabel as well. A family legacy, he called it. The preparations for the exhibition became a family project that united them in purpose. Old pieces were restored, new ones created. Specifically for the show, Harris worked tirelessly, his health concerns seemingly forgotten in the creative surge that possessed him. The night before the exhibition opening, Martha found Harris alone in the workshop, putting the finishing touches on a piece she hadn't seen before, an intricate relief carving of a family tree with branches bearing the names of every Wilson, past and present, including those who had been lost and found again. "It's magnificent," she said, admiring the delicate work. Harris nodded, his expression serene. "It's taken me decades to understand, but family isn't just who we're born to. It's who welcomes us home when we've been lost." The exhibition opening the next evening was a greater success than any of them had anticipated. The gallery was packed with art lovers, local media, and curious community members drawn by the story of the rediscovered master craftsman. But the most significant moment came not from the public acclaim, but from a private exchange Martha witnessed between Harris and Henry as they stood before a joint creation, a magnificent cabinet they had designed and built together, combining Harris's traditional techniques with Henry's modern sensibilities. "We make a good team," Harris said tentatively, watching his son's profile. Henry turned to his father, decades of pain and misunderstanding finally giving way to acceptance and possibility. "Yes," he agreed simply, "we do." In that moment, Martha saw the final transformation, from strangers bound by blood but separated by lies, to father and son connected by truth, forgiveness, and a shared future. The journey that had begun 9 months ago, when a grumpy old man, with nothing but a small suitcase, had arrived on their doorstep, had led them here. To healing, to wholeness, to family redefined. Later that evening, as the last guests departed, and the Wilson family gathered to celebrate their collective success, Martha found herself standing slightly apart, observing the scene before her. Harris, surrounded by his children, grandchildren, and sister, was laughing at something Rachel had said. Henry stood beside him, their resemblance striking now that they had begun to mirror each other's mannerisms. Isabel sat nearby, her children, chatting animatedly with their newly discovered cousins. Judith moved among them all, the family historian, connecting past to present with her stories. In joining this family, Martha had gained relationships she had never imagined, but it was the transformation of Harris Wilson that touched her most deeply. The bitter, isolated man who had arrived that autumn day was gone, replaced by a patriarch, who had reclaimed not just his family connections, but his identity as an artist, a father, a brother, a grandfather, a whole person, no longer defined by loss and separation. As if sensing her thoughts, Harris looked up and met her gaze across the room. His blue eyes, once clouded with resentment and pain, now shone with gratitude and peace. He raised his glass to her in a silent toast, acknowledging what they both knew, that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply believing there's more to someone's story than what the world can see. In the months that followed, the Wilson family continued to evolve and heal. The exhibition led to commissions for both Harris and Henry, their distinctive but complementary styles attracting attention from collectors and interior designers. They established a small family business, Wilson & Wilson Fine Woodcraft, with Rachel gradually taking on more responsibility as her skills developed. For Martha, the most rewarding aspect of this new chapter was watching the deepening bond between her husband and his father. The tentative truce that had begun in the workshop had blossomed into genuine affection and respect. They still disagreed. Both were stubborn men with strong opinions, but the underlying current of bitterness had been replaced by the gentle ribbing and comfortable silences of a healthy father-son relationship. 18 months after Harris's arrival, as the family gathered for Thanksgiving dinner, Martha realized with a start that no one would describe the patriarch as grumpy anymore. The transformation was complete. The withdrawn, defensive man who had arrived with nothing but a small suitcase and decades of unspoken resentment had become the heart of their expanded family, his warmth and wisdom drawing them all together. As they settled around the table, Harris at the head, surrounded by his children, grandchildren, sister, and the extended family that had grown to include Isabel's children and their partners, Martha caught his eye and smiled. He returned the smile with a slight nod of understanding. They had both known, in their different ways, that there was more to his story than met the eye, and through patience, compassion, and an unwavering belief in second chances, they had uncovered not just the truth of one man's past, but the healing power of family rediscovered. Harris rose to carve the turkey, his hands steady and sure, a master craftsman even in this simple domestic task. As he served each family member, he took a moment to connect. A quiet word for Henry, a wink for Rachel, a gentle squeeze of Isabel's shoulder, a knowing smile for Judith. When he finally took his seat again, he raised his glass. "To family," he said simply, "lost and found." "To family," they echoed, their voices blending into a harmony of belonging. And in that moment, Martha knew that the greatest work of art in the room wasn't the elaborate wooden centerpiece Harris and Henry had created for the occasion, or the family tree carving that now hung proudly in the living room. It was this, the family itself, broken and scattered by lies, now restored and reassembled by truth, a masterpiece of resilience, forgiveness, and love. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.